Hope you're doing well. As you know, we're still in lockdown with COVID, and so we're continuing on with the book of 2 Samuel. And again, this video is intended to be a brief introduction to chapter 10 of 2 Samuel. And you can always download from the website the commentary as well as the questions. We want to encourage you to do that, to go through those questions, to read the commentary. There's tons of material there that I just can't possibly put into a video. And so if you want to study the text here, I think it's going to be very helpful for you and hopefully encouraging. And so this chapter is really the last chapter before we come to David's great sin with Bathsheba, and this chapter sort of functions in a very helpful way in order to sort of move the narrative toward what happens in chapter 11. We see this very clearly with a lot of the word usage and some other things that are happening here. Now, if you remember, chapters 1 through 5, David becomes the king in Israel. Chapter 6, he moves the Ark of the Covenant into the city of Jerusalem. Chapter 7, he receives the Davidic covenant from God. And then in chapters 8 and 9, what we've seen is that David has been a righteous king. He's doing the right things. When it comes to war, he's being blessed by God. And when it comes to just the kindness to Mephibosheth and him keeping covenant, keeping hesed with this member of Saul's household, David's doing what's right. And that's been the consistent pattern here. And as long as he does what's right, what you notice is that God continues to pour out the Mosaic blessings on him. And so he now is beginning to receive, through the Mosaic covenant and his obedience to it, the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant. He's getting the land. God's providing all these things for him. This is all taking place for David. It looks good. I mean, you look from the outside and you say, man, things are going great. Maybe this guy really is the seed. But chapter 10 sort of functions as a bit of a hinge. And what's happening here is you have this description of a war. Now, many things happen in the course of history and in David's life, but the narrator chooses this specific war event. And there's some reasons why, and I think we'll see them as we go through the chapter. So in the first 5 chapters and the first 5 verses of chapter 10, what we see is this interaction between King David and the king of the Ammonites, the son of the king of the Ammonites, whose name is Hanun. And this Hanun, he says he's the son of Nahash, and Nahash has shown kindness to David. And so David wants to show kindness back. He wants to sort of do the same thing he's done with Mephibosheth, but to do it to this man named Hanun, this son of Nahash, Hanun. And what he says is essentially, what I want to do is show that same kindness. I want to show the same covenant loyalty to him. And so I'm going to make this agreement. I'm going to send blessings to him. And so he sends certain of his servants to go and sort of console him about the death of his father. It's a nice thing. It's verse 2 there. You see that. So David sent some of his servants to console him concerning his father. And so there's this sense where David's sort of trying to make him feel good, maybe bring presents to him, do something to help him because his father Nahash has died. So that's the image that's being pictured here. David's not doing anything wrong. He's doing something nice for this young man. Well, this young man listens to his counselors, the princes, and we're going to see this happen again in 1 Kings when David's grandson Rehoboam listens to the young counselors and gets himself into trouble. And so maybe the moral of the story is never listen to young people. Just kidding. But what happens is almost the exact same. Hanun listens to the young princes who counsel him, and they say, David's not here to console you. This isn't about Nahash. This is actually about David's thirst for power. He's here to try to do something against you. He wants to search the city, and it says spy it and seek to overthrow it. And so there's this sense where they say, well, this is actually false. Those aren't his real motives. What do? Well, they do something very shameful to these messengers from David. They shave half their beard. So they just shave half their beard. Now, beard was a sign of essentially virility and masculinity. And so to shave half the beard is to essentially make you a half man. It's very, very shameful. And then they take their robes and they cut them off at the hips, exposes them. This is extremely disrespectful behavior. And so they disrespect these messengers and they send them back to Israel. Not a good thing to do. David is not one to take something like this lightly. And so what does David do? Well, they send a message to David and they say, hey, this is what happened to us. David says, stop in Jericho. The first place you can, stop in Jericho and wait until your beards regrow. So there's a period of time, probably not that long, a couple of weeks, their beards regrow and they come in and David says, this is what we're going to do. Now, what you find out is that even already the Hanun and his men know that there's problems for them, that they've made themselves, it says in verse 6, odious to David. And so Ammon, this guy, the sons of Ammon, Hanun being their king, they send and try to gather an army. So they pull together this huge army, lots and lots of people from different areas, and he calls them all together, really enemies of David that have already been covered in chapter 8, and he calls all these people together to make one large army in order to sort of protect himself against David and the coming army, the invasion that he knows is coming. And what happens? Well, Joab goes, David sends Joab, and Joab goes, and he goes to fight. And now, starting in verse 9, you have the story of the war. And what happens here in this war is that Joab and Abishai, his brother, are fighting, and Joab and Abishai sort of make an agreement. They say, listen, I'm going to fight this way, and you're going to fight this way, and hopefully we'll be strong enough to fight against all these things. And if we're not, then here's what we're going to do. If I start to get weak, you help me. And if you start to get weak, I'm going to come help you. And one way or the other, hopefully we can defend both sides. Well, what ends up happening is actually both of them are successful. There's this really interesting line. It says that he selected the choice men of Israel, and he arrayed them in the front and in the rear. There's going to be problems. And in verse 7 even it says, when David heard of it, he sent Joab, the army, and all the mighty men. That's not a good thing if you're Hanun and the people of Ammon. And so here's this picture of David sending out the best of the army. They fight against the Arameans and they fight against the Ammonites, and guess what? They win the battle. Of course, we would expect this, right? He's still in covenant obedience. And what happens? The Arameans, they flee, and the Ammonites are left alone. Okay, so what happens? Well, the Arameans, they see that the Ammonites have taken off. They leave them out there, and so they gather them together. They gather themselves together, and essentially they go out to sort of fight. And basically, David is told, Joab's already left, but David is told that the Arameans now have gathered themselves together and that they're now going to come and fight. And so David says, okay, send the army back out again. And so the army goes back out again, and they again fight this battle. And again, the Arameans are defeated. And in verse 18, it says the Arameans fled before Israel, and David killed 700 charioteers of the Arameans and 40,000 horsemen, and struck down Shobach, the commander of their army, and he died there. So essentially what happens is David again has victory over the Arameans, and he does it through the army. Now, what's interesting here is that David never leaves the city of Jerusalem in this entire chapter. And what gets repeated 10 times in this chapter is the phrase sent. David sends Joab, David sends messengers, then David sends Joab, then David sends Abishai, then David sends Joab and Abishai, David sends the mighty men, and there's this constant sending out. David is essentially functioning as a king who's making war not with the people, but now just by sending out the people. And this becomes critically important, right? In fact, we even see this. David gets the credit for killing the charioteers and 40,000 men in verse 18 of chapter 10, but he wasn't actually there. It's the army that he's sent to do it. Now, what you notice in chapter 11, verse 1, and this is going to become very important, then it happened in the spring, at the time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants. This is where chapter 10 becomes a hinge. He's sending the army, but he's not personally doing anything with the army. Why? Well, he's back in the city of Jerusalem. What's he doing? Nothing good, right? He's putting himself into a situation that is not going to be helpful for him in his spiritual state. And this is going to give us chapter 11 and the sin with Bathsheba. But we're not there yet. Still, God is blessing David, blessing the nation, blessing the people, because David is continuing to still obey. He hasn't stumbled in the way that he is going to stumble with Bathsheba. And so, really, chapter 10 is just a hinge point. It's a moving point between chapter 9 and the events and the blessings of God, of David's covenant loyalty to Mephibosheth, and now chapter 10, when David breaks every covenant and violates everything in terms of his sin. In between those two is chapter 10, where David is sending out the army, and God continues to bless, but you see the beginning, sort of the cracks in the foundation of David's kingly authority, David's position as king. No longer going out with the people, no longer doing the things that he ought to be doing. Instead, he's selfish, staying at home, and we know probably making plans to do things that he shouldn't be doing. So that's what's happening in chapter 10. Hope that's helpful. Take some time, read the commentary, go through the questions. I think it'll be very helpful for you. I think you'll enjoy it as we continue to study this book. Thanks for watching.